Welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Marius Eppes. We are going to keep following our protagonist Hans Burgner through his dark valley in his experience after he committed the murder of his teacher and stole the elixir of life, the Red Lion. And things are still not looking really great for him. The next few chapters are short, and we'll see what happens to him.
Du våker, for natten skader ingen, og jeg lover. Jeg vil våke ved din side, og vokte deg i natt. Og til deg, hver dag er rød mens du sover, for dagen er din venn, og jeg lover, når den er over, vil jeg våke ved din side, og vokte
Chapter 7, The Conjuring. Soon, the day I had set to perform the conjuring arrived. All the preparations were complete. It was new moon. The sharp arc sparkled in the autumn sky among the impossibly close stars. I had selected a tower chamber with eastern windows for the experiment. At my instructions, 4 greenish concave mirrors without frames had been hung to face each other on the walls. There was a large white marble altar against the northern wall. It had been hung with a magnetized iron chain, and the pentagram was set into it in gold. I ceremoniously stretched a fresh sheepskin in front of the altar. It too had the pentagram embroidered in various colors. There was a copper incense burner of charcoal and bay leaves on a tripod on the altar, and I put another on a small 3-legged table. Then the Marquis and I changed into long, loose robes of purest white, specially woven for the occasion. We crowned ourselves with wreaths of vervain strung on gold chains. When this was done, I drew the magnetic lines on the Marquis's body to put him into the state of wakeful sleep in which the mind can take in astral light. It was in this state that the great Sabbath orgies confessed by various sorcerers to the Inquisition occurred. I could feel the Marquis tremble as I drew the lines. I kept hoping he would tell me to stop, finding at the last minute he couldn't endure the great trial. But he said nothing. His desire to be free of his curse had conquered his weakness. I unrolled the parchment on which I had written the incantations. I stirred up the fire in both burners, then began reading. At first, I spoke softly, but gradually my voice grew louder. The fire began to glow in the burners, and the thick, spicy smoke rose over the room. Nervous flames leapt from the embers, throwing wild, evil patterns on the wall. Then suddenly, the flaming tongues collapsed, as though an invisible hand had smothered them. The glowing coals dimmed slowly, straining our expectation to the breaking point. White clouds rose from the altar, and I was horrified to feel the floor shudder underneath me as though I were in an earthquake. I heard the deep tolling of a bell, and my heart thumped wildly. I was able to continue only because I had memorized the procedure thoroughly. I threw more charcoal on the burners and stepped into the chalk circle I had drawn between the altar and the table. Closing my eyes and pronouncing each syllable distinctly, I shouted the name of Solomon Trismosen 3 times. My eyes opened of their own volition. Suddenly I became extraordinarily cold. Now the embers were blazing again, illuminating the room with the light of oppressive dreams. The apocalyptic light revealed the figure of a powerful old man, his hazy shape multiplied by the 4 mirrors. Every other sound and motion in the room froze abruptly. Even the tongues of flame stood still, and the astral hordes that surrounded us shrank from the being. I felt a numb tranquility, the peace that comes to the wretched outlaw when he is finally caught by the forces of justice. I knew that my presence in this magic circle had been predetermined. The circumstances were merely the bloodhounds of fate. I forgot about the Marquis. I was staring spellbound into the eyes of the apparition. I knew the look, of course. I had never forgotten it. It was something I had feared because I couldn't understand it. And its peaceful coolness had lived on behind all my desperate barricades. The face that belonged to the eyes took form as I watched. It wasn't quite Rochard's face, but it was so similar. I could hear the Marquis moaning near me. As I began to relive my memories of Rochard, the face changed to the one I remembered after I had crushed it to a bloody pulp in that single moment of frenzy. The room was filled with the silence of surrender and defeat. One thought only pounded through my head. How could I have killed somebody who was immortal? I had just shattered the form, broken the mirror that reflected the one indestructible being. I don't know if he really spoke or if I just heard his voice in my head coming up from my subconscious mind where knowledge is not yet formulated into words. But now I understood. It was just one person who stood before us. Nicholas Flamel, Solomon Trismosen, or Edward and Selmus Rochard. All were one after the great transmutation had condensed the divine essence from the disintegrating satanic element. So the contact had been made with the other world, the sphere of the divine initiation. It was not the word of a sinner dragged to hell by the weight of his deeds that had penetrated the sphere of Mercury. It was the call of the divine ego that lives in every being, the essence that cannot murder and cannot die. For an instant, the spirit mirror played over my past and future lives as though over some ravaged battlefield. My spiritual landscape had not changed. It still smoldered with crime and mad destruction. The road of my future faded into an infinity of frightful desolation. I had built an empire of clotted blood. The victims I had killed, hated, and feared had become my eternal companions, nourished by my energy. I was bound body and soul to the morgue of this world, by handcuffs of desire and selfishness. And now, the law with a capital L was here in front of me. No, not in front, in me. The greenish blue eyes into which I stared seemed to speak within me. I have forgiven you. It is not I who punish you. You yourself are both murderer and victim. The sin and salvation from it lie in yourself alone. The earth is just a dark reflection of the astral ocean, a reflection that shows everything upside down. What seems bad is good, and what seems good is bad. What seems to be destruction is really construction. Birth and death are really interchangeable terms. Suffering is atonement, and pleasure is downfall. What is hoarded is really borrowed. Redemption comes from martyrdom. You can begin to move toward the highest goal from the lowest point of the deepest depth. There is yet a nucleus of divine light in the womb of deepest darkness. When a change of direction occurs, the result is not necessarily visible immediately. Still, the necessary step has been taken. Remember, you must repay to the last penny, and suffering is the payment. The point of greatest pain is the turning point toward the highest goal. I heard moaning in the distance, and only later did I realize it was I myself who had moaned. I was too deep within myself listening to that voice. It took some time for the Marquis's feverish and disjointed words to register in my consciousness. Take your name off that wall. Get it out of my head, out of my soul. I can't bear it anymore. Leave me in peace. Ah! Now the flames danced madly, and the voice resounded through the whole room. Only blood can wash away blood. My name is written here in blood. A mighty wind swept the room, and the figure disappeared. Darkness closed in on us, and the censers smoked like gigantic chimneys. There was a moan beside me, followed by a prolonged crashing. The Marquis had fallen unconscious on the floor and had dragged the table holding one of the censers with him. Still dazed, I tried to pull out my tinderbox, but suddenly I was too weak to move. My knees shook, and I broke out in a sweat under the long robe. I had to sit down again. I couldn't seem to get in touch with my body. Time and again my consciousness submerged into the spiritual ocean. The Marquis was an island of reality somewhere near me, dead or fainted in a room full of smoke and smells. Someone else hunched beside him in a backless chair, fingering a withered wreath of vervain. All this had no connection with me. Now even the spiritual sea grew dark. I don't know how much time I spent in the twilight world of the formless subconscious. It was almost as if I had died and not yet been reborn. A cold, overcast dawn breathed through the narrow window onto the white altar, the overturned table, and the body in white linen. The wreath had slipped off, I noticed, and his fingers seemed to be trying to grasp the floor. Someone was knocking on the door, and there was a babble of voices outside. I could not move my sluggish, newly returned body, and my mind was yet too hazy to fear or escape what must come. Gradually, more voices had assembled in front of the door, and the knocking was now a frantic pounding on the door. I couldn't move even when they broke it down. Shocked servants lifted the Marquis to a chair, and the frightened-looking doctor drew his blood and administered vinegar and anise. The Marquis's grim priest, Frater Bertoldus, sprinkled holy water on his face. Under these ministrations, the Marquis opened his eyes and looked around blankly. When he saw me, his eyes lit with horror, and he clutched Frater Bertoldus convulsively and whispered in his ear. The priest turned to look at me. I could read my fate in his malicious satisfaction. Chapter 8. The lowest point of the deepest depth. I did not try to resist the violent hands. I was helpless and only half conscious. They dragged me bodily down the corridors that ran under the castle. Here the stones sweated green slime. I thought they would lock me in one of these windowless cellars, but I was wrong. An iron ring was set into the middle of the floor in one cell. They attached a chain to it, ran the other end over a hook in the ceiling, and began pulling on it with all their might. The fat, round stone came up with a dull plop, and an odor of rottenness welled up around us. Then they tied a rope to my waist and pushed me into the hole. As the ground disappeared from under my feet, my terrified life instinct reawakened. I realized I was being lowered into a narrow well shaft cut in solid rock. Many things were atoned for during that descent as I banged into the sharp rocks that opened bleeding cuts. A howl of mad fright burst from me as this descent into hell continued, apparently into eternity. But then I found my feet in icy water, which swiftly moved up past my knees to my waist. I had reached the bottom, and the rope was thrown after me. It crashed onto my head with a painful wetness even as I heard the heavy stone close over me. My hands groped on the slippery stones as I tried to find the dimensions of my prison. The Marquis wanted to make sure I could not escape like Solomon Trismosen. Certainly no one could escape from this. I felt under my garments. The box was still there, the box containing the elixir of eternal life. I jerked the leather bag from around my neck and threw it into the water. No! My voice rang in the confined space. Almighty God, my God, no, help me, forgive me. Then I fell silent, horrified. Mechanically, I began to notice the darkness and the stench and the dripping of water from the stones. Time had no meaning. I counted the drips to measure it, but I finally had to give up. My body felt like lead, pulling me into the depths. If I could just sleep, I would perish. Die. Oh my God, not die, but I would be free from fear. I lowered myself into the water until finally it was over my head. Stagnant water rushed into my mouth and nose, and my blood pounded in my ears. I waited, and then terror forced me to surface. My lungs couldn't take the strain. I should have suffocated with the fluid rattling in my lungs, but I was alive. I hadn't been able to endure the agony. Thus I could not commit suicide. My body had been damned to life by the elixir. Life clung to me indeed like the death grip of a monster. I would have to live in this walled-in crypt without light or food, rest or hope, forgotten by everyone as long as my damned body would last. This was surely the lowest point of the deepest depth. Racked with hunger, I cried, shouted, and cursed, cursing myself, Roshar, God, and my own life. Then I started begging for mercy. Meanwhile, the water dripped on. 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 drops. I began praying to demons, to the powers of darkness. I pounded on the walls until my fists were a bloody mass. I gnawed my arm in a desperate attempt to relieve my hunger, and the water kept dripping. I counted the drips. What time was it? Was it day or night? How many days had I been here? Or maybe it was years. It was 100,000 drops of water. 1,000,000. I went through periods of rage, followed by apathy. As I became weaker, the periods of apathy grew longer, At last, I fell into a troubled sleep and my feet refused to hold me up. My muscles and flesh had slowly degenerated and the struggling life flame flickered within the wasted form. And as I lay, motionless in mute surrender, death finally came. Chapter 9. The Valley of the Shadow. For a long time, I didn't realize I was no longer attached to my body. I thought I was still slumped in that prison of uncrushable bones. Then suddenly, I saw the skeleton under me, crumbling in the phosphorescent light of decay. I was both attracted and repelled by the sight. Now I was formless, a bewildering, tormenting sensation. Abruptly, I was swept away by a howling astral current. The well disappeared, but my phosphorescent corpse stayed in my mind's eye for a long time before it faded. Then I saw my demons again. They were being swept away with me, and they bumped and jerked me about in the merciless elemental flood. We were united now, horrible embryos on long, mysterious umbilical cords. I was swimming in a nightmarish twilight among other shades like myself, each chained to its attendant cluster of demons. I yearned desperately for an escape, for light, rest, and freedom from these demons. I clawed to a level where I could dimly see ahead of me a clear and open tranquility where I could surely find it. But it was like trying to swim against a tidal wave. I continued to drift with the gyrating forces, plunging and struggling. Suddenly the forces concerted in a tightening spiral. I was caught in the vortex and propelled through the astral matter by writhing human bodies. A cry of lust was distinguishable in the chaos around me. Then the core of the vortex opened and sucked me in. Now I was captured, impaled on a new stake. It was a thin thread that tied me, but it was tough, and the thread kept growing shorter with the passage of months. I was revolving in a mother body whose womb was provided by astral beings with the necessary substances of life. This was my new refuge. And so next time we will start with Chapter 10, The Professor of Marburg.
Plan, searching my land for an enemy, came across love's sweet cause, and in the face of beauty, evil was lost. Full of eyes, minds full of lies, blank from their cold hearts down to their graves, murdered the dawn, spreading their scorn, cursing the sun of which love was born. We must keep them away, or pretty soon we'll pay and count the cost in sorrow. Sacrifice, the future has its price, and today's only yesterday's tomorrow. and today is only yesterday's tomorrow. Tomorrow.